She was left in a wooden box with 3 words carved across the lid, no need for her. Broken, silent, and barely breathing. The tiny white German shepherd had already been forgotten by the world until one man opened that box. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a quiet, powerful choice that would rewrite both of their lives. But when a family came to adopt her, everything changed again. And her final decision stunned everyone. What did she choose, freedom or the one who never gave up? It was the kind of afternoon when the sun sat high and quiet over the hills of Montana, where even the winds seemed to pause and listen, and where shadows took their time, stretching across the dry grass that framed the fences of Hollow Ridge Shelter. Evan had stepped out for just a breath, a moment away from the hum of machines and antiseptic smells inside the clinic, his hands still stained faintly with iodine and paw prints. He stood under the crooked pine that had grown beside the gate long before the shelter was built, its needles dark green against a sky washed in gold. That was when he saw it. The box sat at the base of the tree like it had always been there, wooden splintered at the corners, the kind used for hauling apples or potatoes, now mottled with mud and sun-bleached at the edges. Its lid was askew, the inside hidden in shadow. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than discarded storage, just another forgotten thing. But then, something inside it shifted. Evan froze. The movement had been so slight it might have been a trick of heat, the way light wavered over pavement. But as he stepped closer, he heard them, the flies lifting in a cloud when his shadow crossed the box. And then he saw her. Curled in the farthest corner of that rough crate, crammed between a stained towel and a rusted hinge, was a puppy. A German shepherd or something close to it. Her fur, where it was still fur, was white, but dulled and tangled with grime so matted along her legs and back that it clumped like wet wool. Her body folded in on itself as if she had shrunk every part she could just to disappear. Her nose was tucked beneath a trembling foreleg, one paw twisted at a wrong angle, the pads raw. Cuts lined her side, not deep, but old enough to darken into angry bruises. She made no sound. Evan dropped to his knees, the dry grass crunching beneath him. His hand hovered just above her, unsure if touch would help or harm. Unsure if she'd flinch, bite, run, though something deep in him already knew she wouldn't. She didn't look up. Didn't lift her head. But slowly, as if it cost her more than she had left to spend, she opened one eye. Cloudy, dry, unfocused. And yet it held something. Not fear, not even pain. It was absence. A hollow gaze that saw through him like he wasn't there, or maybe like she wasn't. He whispered, "Hey, baby girl. You're okay now." His voice broke partway through. He wasn't sure why. On the side of the box, half covered in sap stains, and the shadow of his own arm, were 4 words carved in jagged, hasty letters. No need for her. No exclamation. No apology. Just a dismissal. Cold, final. Evan's chest tightened, something hot rising behind his eyes as he reached into the box, sliding his arms beneath the fragile weight of her. She didn't fight it. Didn't even respond. Her body hung limp, hotter than it should have been, skin fever warm to the touch and light so impossibly light. He'd lifted heavier cats. The sun hit them both full on as he stood up. Her head lolled against his chest, her breath shallow, nearly silent. And just for a second the world narrowed to nothing but this, the heat against his skin, the faint scent of dust and blood, and the presence of something so breakable it made his own breath catch in his throat. He turned toward the shelter, already shouting for help. "I need fluids now." The doors swung open. Voices followed. Hands moved quickly. Towels, needles, saline bags. But Evan didn't let go. Not yet. He stayed beside the table as they worked, crouched low so she could feel someone there. Someone constant. Her body remained still, her eyes closed again. If not for the rise and fall of her chest, he might have thought. "She's been out there a while," one of the techs muttered, inspecting the crusted wounds. Evan nodded slowly. Someone saw her as trash. He didn't mean to say it aloud, but it slipped out like truth always did when you weren't bracing for it. He stayed with her through the afternoon, past shift change, past sunset. The clinic grew quiet around them, machines humming in tired rhythm, the hallway lights dimmed. She hadn't moved once. They hadn't named her yet. There was no paperwork, no tag, no history. She was just intake number 4479, but not to Evan. In his head, she'd already been claimed. Nova. He didn't know why the name came to him. Maybe it was the whiteness beneath the filth? Or the way her small form reminded him of something celestial. A burst of light in the dark, even if she didn't know it yet. He'd once read that a nova wasn't the birth of a star, but the sudden flare of something already dying. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that this name felt right, gentle, strong, a declaration. As he whispered it Nova, he felt the smallest twitch of her paw. Maybe it was nothing, a nerve, a reflex. But in that moment it felt like agreement, like recognition. He found a blanket from the closet, soft and worn, and laid it beside her on the metal table. Then after a moment's hesitation, he pulled an old teddy bear from the storage bin, the kind they usually saved for adoption days, a little frayed at the ears, but whole. He placed it beside her. She didn't react, not yet. But somehow, it felt like a promise. Outside, the wind had picked up rustling the dry pines beyond the fence. But in the stillness of that room, Nova's presence was louder than any storm. Evan sat beside the table, his back against the wall. Knees pulled up, watching her breathe. Each inhale shallow. Each exhale so faint, it nearly disappeared into the fluorescent hum. But she was breathing. And for now, that was enough. He didn't fall asleep, but he didn't move either. Hours passed. Shadows shifted. Somewhere down the hallway, a door clicked shut, and he barely noticed. Because his focus stayed on that fragile rise and fall, the way the blanket beneath her curled slightly beneath the weight of her tiny body, the faint scent of pine sap still clinging to her fur. He kept thinking, how long had she waited there? How many people had passed by that box? Had anyone seen her? Had someone meant for her to be found, or just thrown her away and driven off? There were no answers. Only Nova lying silent in the dim light, her story beginning with 4 words etched into a box, and a man who hadn't meant to step outside at that exact moment but did. And now, as the first threads of morning light began to pull across the sky, something in the room shifted. A breath. A movement. A whisper of life, just barely enough to hint that she might still be there. And just as Evan leaned forward, his hand reaching gently toward her paw, a question burned in his chest. Would she choose to stay? The light inside the medical room was a soft blend of dusk and fluorescent glow, casting long reflections on the linoleum floor that stretched like ripples around Evan's knees. Nova lay on the padded table in the center of it all, silent, unmoving, and heartbreakingly small. She wasn't sleeping. Not really. It was more like her body had folded itself into stillness, choosing quiet over resistance, as if staying completely still might erase her presence, might allow the world to forget her, or allow her to forget the world. Her weight was so little that even the blanket he'd placed beneath her seemed too much, as though it could crush instead of comfort. Her head rested to one side, eyes closed, ears limp. That tangled, dirt-caked fur along her neck and spine no longer looked like part of a living creature. It looked like something left behind, something that once mattered, but hadn't for a while. Evan stood beside her with gloved hands, carefully lifting the damp cloth again, dabbing at the grime along her flank. The water in the basin had already gone murky, touched by dried blood and the faint brown residue of dust and old oil. Her paws, once pink and soft in their youth, were raw pads, cracked and swollen, the fur around them darkened with crusted wounds. One of her legs, her back left, was twisted in a way that made his stomach turn. Not broken, but bent unnaturally. The angle wrong, as if it had been trapped in something for too long or forced under her body while she lay unmoving for days. There was no swelling, no fresh bleeding, but the injury spoke of time of hours or more passed in helpless stillness. Her chest barely moved. "Celine's slow," Lisa said from across the room, her voice gentle. She adjusted the IV bag with practiced hands, tapping the line threaded into Nova's foreleg. Veins are thin, but holding. Evan nodded but didn't speak. His focus was locked on the rise and fall of Nova's side. Each breath was so soft that he found himself counting between them. 3 seconds, sometimes 5. As if her body was asking permission from the world each time it dared to pull in air again. Nova made no noise, no yelps, no whimpers. Not even the tiny grumble of protest that most puppies gave when touched unexpectedly. She accepted everything being lifted, being cleaned, being poked with needles, with a stillness that said less about trust and more about resignation, like she had nothing left to resist with. "She's not flinching," Lisa said after a while, brushing a fresh cloth across Nova's shoulder. "Not even blinking during insertion." "That's not good," Evan replied quietly. It wasn't numbness in the medical sense, it was deeper than that. It was detachment. Nova wasn't responding because she had drifted far from here, from her body and this world. And Evan didn't know if there was a way back. He took a deep breath, dipped the cloth again, and pressed it against the matted fur under her chin. The scent that rose was a mix of old sweat rot and something sour left over, fear maybe. He worked slowly, trying not to disturb the fragile rhythm of her heartbeat, which fluttered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Let's keep her warm," Lisa said, stepping away to retrieve the heated blankets from the shelf. Nova's limbs remained tucked tight into her body, the way a frightened animal tries to protect its core. Her tail curled inwards, a limp loop beside her ribs. Evan recognized that posture. It was one of hiding, of tucking into oneself so small that maybe the hurt couldn't reach. "She's got old scabs on both sides," he murmured. "Could be from dragging herself." Lisa returned with the blanket and helped tuck it gently around Nova's body, careful not to shift her legs too far. When the soft warmth wrapped around her, a tremor ran through her, subtle but real. Not fear, not pain. Just her body reacting to something it hadn't known in a long time. Comfort. Evan sat back on the stool beside the table, his gloves now streaked with diluted blood and grime. His arms were tired. But he didn't leave. The silence around them settled deeper. Outside, dusk had finally turned to night, and the windows framed only darkness now. The pines near the edge of the shelter rustled faintly in the evening wind. Inside, the soft beeping of heart monitors and the hiss of the IV pump filled the space like background music to a fragile symphony. Evan didn't speak to Nova. Not at first. He didn't know what to say. Words felt too heavy in that room, too sharp. So instead, he watched her. Every now and then, he adjusted the blanket or wiped another smear from her fur. At one point, he ran a finger gently along the edge of her ear, the only part of her that wasn't injured, just to remind her that someone saw her. She didn't respond. But she didn't pull away. And somehow that felt like something. Hours passed that way. Shift change came and went. Lisa left quietly after setting up the nighttime vitals sheet, her eyes meeting Evan's with unspoken understanding. No one asked him to stay. No one told him to go. It was just understood. Nova wasn't just a case file. Not anymore. Somewhere around midnight, the overhead lights dimmed on their automatic timer, bathing the room in a softer tone. The hum of the air conditioning grew louder in the quiet, and outside a single coyote called across the ridge before falling silent again. Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table edge. His fingers reached for Nova's paw, brushing just beside the tape holding the IV line in place. Her paw was small, almost bird-like, the claws long and untrimmed, but dull. It didn't twitch, didn't close. But he left his hand there anyway. And then barely, he felt it. A tremble. Not from the fluid line and not from his own hand. From her. A minute vibration beneath the pad of her paw, as if her body was beginning to remember itself. Like her cells were checking in one by one, asking, "Are we still here?" He exhaled slowly and whispered, "You're doing good, Nova. You're here now. You're safe." He didn't expect a response, but a second later, her eyes opened. Just slightly. Just enough to reveal that pale, clouded blue that he remembered from the box beneath the pine. This time, though, her gaze didn't drift past him. It landed on him. Weak, yes, unfocused. But there. Evan leaned closer, trying to stay still, not to scare her back into herself. "Hey," he murmured. "I see you." Nova blinked once. Then her eyes closed again slowly, like it took effort. She didn't move again after that. Her breathing stayed shallow, her body limp. But that single look, that barely there moment of awareness, it changed something. Because now Evan knew she was still fighting. Not loudly, not with teeth or growls or barking, but with presence, with breath, with a twitch beneath a blanket, with a flicker of trust, in a glance that asked nothing but, "Am I allowed to stay?" He stayed beside her until the clock on the wall blinked past 2 a.m., the digits glowing in quiet blue. The basin of water had gone cold. His back ached. His eyes burned. But still he sat there. Not because he had to, because she hadn't let go yet. And if Nova hadn't given up on life, then he wasn't about to let her face it alone. Just before dawn, when the first faint streak of pale gray teased the edge of the windowsill, Nova let out a sound. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a whine. It was a breath, shaky, long as if pulled from the very bottom of her chest. And Evan heard it like a promise. A quiet declaration from a fragile body, with a heart still learning how to beat for itself again. And as he leaned in, heart thudding with sudden hope, he noticed her paw had shifted again, just slightly, just enough that it was no longer retreating. The morning arrived without fanfare, no golden rays pouring in, no bird song slicing the silence, just a slow fading of night, the gray lifting in layers off the sky, like breath on cold glass. Evan sat in the same chair he had occupied since the evening before, the blanket draped over his lap, crumpled from restless shifting his shoulders, heavy but still. The air inside the medical room smelled of iodine cloth and the faint earthy tang of wet fur. But beneath that, beneath everything, was the softness of something unspoken. Nova hadn't moved since the last breath that made Evan look up, that long exhale just before dawn, that felt less like surrender and more like surrendering fear. She still lay wrapped in the warmed blanket, her frame no bigger than the length of his arm. But the shape of her had shifted, not physically, not noticeably, but in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way her rib cage now rose, with more steadiness, how each inhale had a rhythm now, even if slow. Maybe it was how the lines of tension around her mouth had softened her muscles, unclenching in sleep that felt less like escape and more like rest. Or maybe most of all, it was that tiny movement in the night. Her paw, worn and bandaged, had shifted gently and come to rest against his hand. Not by accident, not by twitch or instinct, but by choice. He hadn't moved since. He was still holding her paw now, or rather, letting it rest across his knuckles, his palm cupped just enough to offer warmth without weight. She hadn't withdrawn. In fact, in the faint blush of morning light that crept through the frosted window, he noticed that her paw had curled the faintest bend of trust, a grip timid but present, as if her body had finally decided it was safe to ask for something. And that something was to stay. "Hey there, Evan," whispered his voice low, still grainy from lack of sleep. "You're doing good?" Nova didn't stir. Her eyes remained closed. But her breathing, now that he was listening closely again, was steady, almost delicate in its rhythm, like waves on a quiet lake. Every inhale was smooth, every exhale a little deeper than the one before. Her chest lifted, fell lifted again, and each rise felt like a victory. He eased himself off the stool just enough to stretch out the ache in his back, then moved quietly across the room. In the far cabinet near the sink, half hidden behind folded towels and latex glove boxes, he found what he was looking for. A small stuffed bear, its fur flattened in places, its ears a little lopsided, but otherwise intact. It was one of the toys they usually saved for post-op puppies or adoption photo shoots. No one had claimed this one yet. It wasn't much, but Evan figured it could be something familiar. Something soft, something she could claim as hers. He returned to Nova and crouched beside her table. Gently, so gently, he placed the bear near her front paws, nudging it close enough that she could touch it if she chose. It sat there silent and patient, as if waiting to be noticed. For a long time, nothing happened. Nova's breaths continued in their quiet rhythm. Her ears didn't twitch, her head didn't move. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of a generator outside the shelter walls. But Evan didn't mind waiting. It was Lisa who arrived next, stepping lightly into the room with 2 cups of coffee in hand and a tired smile on her face. "You're still here," she said quietly. "Wouldn't be anywhere else." Lisa nodded, her eyes drifting toward the sleeping puppy. "She any better?" Evan glanced down at the small paw still resting against his fingers, then at the bear resting beside it. "She moved last night, reached out." Lisa's face softened. "That's a start." They spoke little after that. Words felt too sharp in the presence of something so delicate. So instead, they settled into the kind of silence that came from shared understanding, the kind that didn't need explaining. Lisa checked Nova's vitals, refreshed the fluids, made a few notes on the clipboard, and left with the same quiet tread she'd entered with. And then, it was just Evan and Nova again. Outside, the day warmed slowly. Through the slit in the window, the sun climbed high enough to cast a single stripe of light across the table. It stretched slowly until it touched the edge of Nova's blanket. The warmth crept inch by inch across her fur, revealing pale threads of white beneath the tangles, catching glimmers in the soft curve of her ear. It was the first sunlight that had touched her in safety. And maybe she felt it. Because without warning, her eyelids fluttered. Not wide, not sudden. Just a slow, flickering shift, as if the brightness stirred something behind them. Her lashes trembled once, then again. And finally her eyes opened slightly, but fully enough for Evan to see blue, pale, clouded, but real. They drifted for a moment, unsure swimming, and then as he leaned in, her gaze met his. There was nothing dramatic in the look. No dramatic recognition, no tail wagging, no sudden movements. But there was presence. A searching quiet in her eyes, like someone halfway between dreaming and waking someone trying to remember what it meant to be noticed. To be seen without being hurt. Evan smiled slow and steady, keeping his voice low. "There you are." Nova didn't blink. He lifted the teddy bear an inch, nudging it gently so that its soft paw rested against hers. "This is for you," he said, "if you want it." Still no movement. But her gaze flicked to the bear. Just once. A tiny flickering glance. And then as the light crept further over the table and warmed her front paws, something remarkable happened. She shifted. It wasn't much. The movement was barely more than a quiver of muscle. But slowly, almost uncertainly, she moved one of her paws bandaged and delicate toward the bear. It didn't land directly on the toy. It hovered, brushed it, then dropped onto Evan's hand again. Only this time the touch was firmer, more deliberate. A gesture that said, "I'm still here." Evan felt the breath catch in his chest. He swallowed hard and blinked quickly, brushing his free hand across his cheek as if wiping dust. "You're doing so good," he murmured. "You're brave. And you're not alone." Nova's eyes closed again, but this time it didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like release, like a momentary surrender into trust, however fragile. The sun had now reached her face, and for the first time, Evan could see what she might look like, cleaned, healthy, alive. Beneath the dirt and scabs, there was softness to her features, a long snout, a round brow, a curve in her cheek that hinted at a youth she hadn't been allowed to have. Her eyelashes were long, her whiskers still glistened faintly, and her breathing stayed even. That afternoon, Evan didn't leave her side. He ate lunch in the room, took phone calls outside the door. When someone asked if he wanted coverage for the evening shift, he shook his head. "Nova moved today," he said. "I'm staying." Later, as the shadows outside grew long again and the shelter began its slow descent into the hush of evening, Evan shifted in his seat and reached for his notebook. He'd started keeping one for her. Nothing official, just observations, things he noticed, things she did. Like how her nose twitched twice when the sun hit her, or how her paw, once limp, now curled slightly, even in sleep. He scribbled a sentence at the top of the page. "Nova reached for me today." And then, almost like she'd been listening, Nova stirred again. This time it wasn't her paw. It was her head, just a little tilt, a tiny effort to lift and adjust. She didn't get far, didn't even lift more than a few inches. But when she lowered it again, it landed softly against the side of the teddy bear. And her body stilled. But her paw didn't move from his. And Evan, sitting in the quiet room with the last amber rays of daylight brushing across the floor, realized something that made his throat tighten. She wasn't just healing. She was choosing to. One gentle breath at a time. And just as he leaned forward to adjust her blanket, Nova's ears twitched and the corners of her mouth moved, barely but enough. As if something deep within her had just remembered what it meant to dream. The morning sun crept through the windows in faint amber threads, illuminating the stainless steel surfaces of the clinic with a kind of softened gold that made everything feel warmer than it was. The world outside Hollow Ridge Shelter stirred slowly, the pine trees stretching upward into a cloudless sky, and birds calling faint greetings from unseen branches. But inside the medical room, time moved differently. It moved to the rhythm of shallow breaths, soft footfalls, and the heartbeat of something quiet but determined. Evan sat at the desk, tucked in the corner beside the cabinet pen, hovering over a blank intake form. He had filled out hundreds of these in the past name, age, breed, condition, but never with hands that trembled just slightly at the wrist. His gaze kept drifting toward the table in the center of the room where the small white puppy lay nestled between layers of warm blankets and one ragged teddy bear. She was still resting, her body curled gently now, not from tension, but from instinct, the posture of an animal at the edge of rest, no longer expecting pain to wake her. Her breathing was steady. Her ears twitched now and then, and once as Evan watched her, her paw flexed in sleep, tapping softly against the bear's plush ear. He smiled, exhaled, and pressed the tip of the pen to paper. Name, Nova, sex, female, breed, German Shepherd, white. Approximate age, 3 months. The ink shimmered faintly beneath the overhead light. He set the pen down beside the clipboard and sat back, staring at the letters. Nova. He whispered it aloud, letting the sound fill the quiet. Nova. It felt right, like naming her wasn't just a formality, but a declaration, a way of giving her identity, of affirming that she was no longer a number, no longer just the puppy in the box. She was Nova now, written in ink, spoken in voice, and held close in something deeper that he couldn't name. Evan stood and walked back to her side. "Did you know?" he said softly, as if speaking to both her and the walls around them. "When I was 9, I had a dog named Bella Nova." Didn't open her eyes, but her ear twitched again. A small movement. Still, it felt like listening. She was a shepherd too, big black and tan. She used to curl up beside my bed at night and sleep with her nose tucked behind my knee. He paused, watching Nova's breathing rise and fall. "One night I had a nightmare, some silly thing about being lost in the woods. And I woke up crying. Bella was already there. She pressed her head into my chest so hard I thought she was trying to keep my heart from falling out." He chuckled under his breath, the sound soft and private. "I didn't cry at her funeral. I just stopped talking for a week. That's what grief does when you're 9. You don't know how to explain it, so you go quiet." Evan crouched beside Nova and reached forward gently, placing 2 fingers near her paw. She didn't move away. Her nose twitched and her eyelids fluttered for a second before settling again. The warmth of her was stronger now, less feverish, more grounded. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he said, voice lower, more to himself than anyone. "But when I look at you, I feel 9 again. Not because I'm broken, but because maybe some pieces finally remember where they used to fit." He let his hand rest beside hers. Minutes passed. The clinic moved around them, staff footsteps in the hallway, a phone ringing once before being picked up. But inside this small room, there was only breath and silence, and the hum of the machines measuring life in tiny pulses. And then Nova stirred. It was subtle, the way her body tensed slightly beneath the blanket, the way her chest lifted with a slightly deeper breath. Evan leaned closer. Her eyes opened, slowly. Not all the way, but enough. And this time they focused. She looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him. There was hesitation in her gaze, that lingering cloud of confusion and fear. But underneath it, something softer had begun to flicker. Recognition. Maybe even curiosity. "Hey," he said gently, smiling, his voice barely more than breath. "You're back." Nova blinked, once, then again. And then, to Evan's astonishment, she moved her head. It was a small shift, just a tilt to the side, her chin dragging faintly along the blanket. But it was deliberate. It was real. Evan felt his heart climb up his throat. "You don't have to do anything," he whispered. "You're doing enough. You're here." And then her nose moved just a nudge toward his hand. She sniffed him, the lightest touch of her damp nose against his fingers. It lasted a heartbeat, 2, and then she licked him. Once, soft, quick, gentle. Evan didn't breathe for a moment. It wasn't affection, not yet. It wasn't joy, but it was something older, something more important: permission. Nova was allowing him in. He blinked fast, his chest tightening with the weight of it. "You're brave," he whispered, "and I see you." Just then, Lisa peeked through the half-open door. "Everything okay?" Evan nodded slowly. She licked my hand. Lisa smiled, eyes softening. "That's huge." He turned back to Nova. "Yeah, it is." Later that afternoon, Evan sat beside her again, with a shallow dish of broth and soft chicken puree. It wasn't time for a full meal. Her body was still fragile, her stomach untested, but they had to try. He held the spoon carefully beneath her nose, barely tilting it. "Just a little," he said softly. "If you're ready." At first, she didn't move, just blinked slowly. Then her nose twitched. Once. Then again. She inched forward. Barely. Her tongue flicked out, tasted the air, the scent of broth, the warmth of chicken. And then she licked the spoon, not greedily, not desperately, just once. She paused, licked again, and then chewed. Evan let out a shaky breath, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "That's it, sweetheart. That's my girl." Nova ate slowly, awkwardly, but without stopping. Spoonful by spoonful, she took in tiny bits of warmth and life and healing. When she finally turned her head away, satisfied or tired, Evan set the dish aside and sat back, unable to stop the quiet, relieved smile on his face. Because in that meal, in that tiny act of choosing food, Nova had made a decision. Not just to eat, to stay. She hadn't come back from the edge with fanfare or fury. She hadn't barked or wagged or whined. But she had eaten from his hand, and that in the language of broken creatures meant everything. The sun was setting outside now, casting golden streaks across the floor, the light brushing against Nova's fur and making it glow like new snow. Her face, though still tired and thinned by sickness, held a softness that hadn't been there before. Her paws tucked under her chest no longer curled from fear, but from rest. Evan sat with her as the day dimmed. He reached for his notebook and added a new line beneath yesterday's entry. "Today, Nova licked my hand. She ate chicken broth. She looked at me, really looked." He tapped the pen against the paper once, then wrote, "She's staying." And just as he closed the notebook, he saw something that made him freeze. Nova had shifted again. Her head now rested against the teddy bear, and her front paw had slid back toward him. And for the first time, her eyes were open, watching. And in that long, quiet moment between sunlight and shadow, Evan understood something, without needing it said. Nova hadn't just survived. She had chosen him. The morning light had grown more confident now, no longer tentative streaks, but full warm slants pouring through the tall windows of the recovery room. Dust motes floated in the sunbeams like snow that had forgotten how to fall, and the quiet hum of the building, the fans. The distant clicking of keys, the rolling of a cart 2 rooms over, felt more alive, more hopeful, like the walls were beginning to breathe again. Nova lay where she always did, curled beneath the soft fleece blanket, one paw still loosely draped over the well-loved teddy bear with the missing ear. Her chest rose and fell with rhythm now. Each breath is no longer a question, but a gentle certainty. Evan sat nearby, scribbling quiet notes in the corner, though his eyes lifted to her every few seconds like they couldn't help themselves. That was when it happened. No warning, no prompting, just life. Moving. Nova stirred, not the small shifts she'd made before. This was different, purposeful. Her head lifted slowly from the blanket, her neck wobbling just slightly from the effort. Her eyes opened, and this time they stayed open clearer, more focused. Her ears twitched. And then, like a tremor in the earth, she moved. She pushed her front paws forward, just slightly testing. Her body wavered. Muscles fluttered beneath the white of her coat, thin and still healing but alive. One paw slipped forward, then the other. She pressed upward, wobbling on trembling forelegs, her hindquarters lagging behind like a stubborn shadow. Her body rose, shaky, bent, but rising. Evan froze, notebook forgotten in his lap. Nova was trying to sit up. He didn't speak, didn't move, barely breathed. He watched as her weight tilted to the right, forcing her to lean on one elbow, then recover. She inched again, determined nose pointed toward the sunlight pooling near the edge of the mat. And then she was upright, sitting, unsteady, crooked, but upright. A tiny puff of breath escaped her lips, and Evan let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You're doing it," he whispered. "Look at you." She blinked as if surprised herself. One of her ears, her left, stood halfway up, alert and almost defiant. But the right one folded softly at the tip, creating a lopsided charm that made her look like a cartoon sketch of a puppy drawn with too much love and not enough symmetry. Evan smiled wider. "A fighter's ear," he murmured. "Always listening even when you're tired." Nova's body wobbled again, and she lowered herself back down slowly, gently. Not from pain, there was no yelp, no recoil, just fatigue. Muscles that hadn't carried her for days were being asked to do something brave. She didn't look frustrated. She looked curious. Evan moved a little closer and placed her favorite plush toy, the fuzz with one stitched eye, next to her front paws. She nosed it lightly, then rested her head against it with a quiet sigh. The room settled again. But something had shifted. Not just in her body, but in the air between them. Later that afternoon, when Lisa stepped in with a fresh tray of food and soft gauze, Evan met her with a look that needed no translation. "She sat up," he said simply. Lisa's eyebrows rose. "No way." About 5 seconds, shaky as hell. But she did it. Lisa looked over at Nova, who was now dozing lightly against her toy, one ear still comically flopped. "She's stubborn," she smiled. "She's Nova," Evan replied. They cleaned her wounds gently, trimmed some of the tangled fur along her legs, and replaced the bandages with fresh ones. Nova tolerated it all, offering only a soft sigh when they pressed near her ribs. And when Evan finished adjusting the edge of her blanket, she shifted just enough to lean into his palm. But the moment that stayed with him came hours later. Evan had wheeled in a small mat onto the floor. Nothing fancy, just a thin cushion laid over a non-slip base. He wanted to see if she could move beyond the table, even just a little, if her instincts were ready to try. He knelt nearby, hands out, not touching her, just present. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "But if you want to try, I'm here." Nova looked at him. She didn't move for a while. She just stared, ears flicking gently at the noises of the clinic. Then slowly, she lifted her head, followed by her front legs. She pressed herself upright again, just like she had before. But this time she didn't stop. She tried to stand. Her back legs wobbled. Her body swayed. One paw slid slightly forward, the bandaged one trailing behind with a dull drag. She paused, panting softly, then tried again. One step, another. Her legs didn't hold evenly. Her spine tilted like a sapling in the wind. But she moved. Evan watched in awe. She stumbled once her front paw caught awkwardly beneath her, and for a moment he thought she might fall. But she righted herself, shaky, determined. 3 more steps. Then she sat panting, one ear, flopping chest rising and falling with effort. "You little miracle," Evan breathed. "That's your wobble." Nova turned her head toward him, and though her eyes were tired, they held a glimmer now of will, of something ancient and instinctual that animals have always known. Movement is life. Evan chuckled softly, his voice filled with wonder. "That's it. That's Nova's wobble." And then just as he reached forward to offer her the plush fox again, her tail moved. Once. Just a twitch. Barely a wave. But it moved. He froze. Nova didn't wag like a healthy dog might. She didn't thump the ground with joy, but that single movement, that quiet flick of her tail, it said something he would never forget. "I feel something again. Something worth staying for." Later, when she settled back on her blanket, she pressed the fox toy to her chest with both front paws as if claiming it. Her head rested on its back, her breath slowing. Evan sat beside her, knees pulled to his chest, unable to stop smiling. He didn't write notes that evening. He didn't need to. The image of her folded ear, her wobbly steps, and the soft wave of her tail were burned into memory. There were moments too sacred for paper. moments that didn't belong in charts. That night, as the lights dimmed and the world outside turned blue and then black, Evan stayed by her side. The clinic slept. Nova did too. And somewhere between her first unsure step and the warmth of the toy she held like a talisman, something unspoken had settled inside her. Not just survival, not just recovery, but ownership of her breath, of her body, of her name. And just before Evan closed his eyes, Nova stirred once more. Not to rise, not to play, but to reach her paw across the blanket and touch his hand again, this time with certainty. The days no longer blurred together. There was a rhythm now, a quiet, careful cadence that pulsed through the walls of the recovery wing and echoed in soft footsteps, slow breathing, and the gentle tap-tap of small paws exploring their way forward. Where once the room had felt like a waiting place, like a space suspended between heartbreak and hope, it had slowly transformed. Not with sudden change, not with fanfare, but with the kind of growth that blooms from stillness. Nova was no longer only recovering, she was living. It began in small ways. Curious glances toward the corners of the room, soft sniffs at new smells near the storage bins, the tiniest bark when the food bowl arrived, almost as if to say, "I'm here. Don't forget me." Her body, though still delicate, moved with purpose now. She sat straighter, her legs held steadier. Her tail, that tentative ribbon of expression, began to curl faintly when Evan entered the room. And her eyes, those pale, searching eyes that once saw through everything, had begun to hold. They met Evan's gaze now and stayed full of questions, trust, and something brighter. Recognition. She knew him. Not as the man who found her. Not as the hands who bandaged and bathed and fed, but as someone she had quietly chosen. Evan noticed it first, when he came in late one morning, the sun already stretching high above the shelter. He had been delayed helping transport a rescued litter from the next town over, and by the time he pushed open the recovery room door, he expected to find Nova curled up with her toy still dozing beneath her favorite blanket. Instead, she was sitting up, ears perked, head lifted. Waiting. As soon as she saw him, her tail gave a slow, measured sweep across the mat. Not wild, not frantic, just enough. "You came back?" He knelt in front of her, heart swelling in his chest. "Of course I did," he whispered. "Where else would I go?" Nova padded toward him, her steps uneven but determined. She didn't stumble anymore. She adjusted, learning her own body again with every stride. And when she reached him, she didn't stop until her nose pressed softly against his knee. That same afternoon, as she sniffed the far corners of the room, like they held secrets only she could decode, Evan stepped out and returned a moment later with a small box. Inside was a gift he had been holding on to, waiting for the right time. Not because she needed it, but because she had earned it. He waited until she had settled on her mat again, panting softly from her adventures. "Hey, Nova," he said, crouching beside her. "I have something for you." Her ears lifted. One still folded sweetly at the tip. Evan reached into the box and pulled out a collar. A soft sea blue band made from woven nylon, delicate but strong. It shimmered faintly when the light caught it, like the calmest piece of sky had been sewn into a circle. Dangling from the front was a silver tag engraved with care. Nova Hollow Ridge. He held it out so she could sniff it first. Nova leaned in, eyes studying the object. She sniffed once, then twice, and nudged it gently with her nose. No flinch, no fear, only interest. Evan smiled. "It's yours." He slipped it gently around her neck, fastening it with a quiet click. The collar settled against her fur like it had been waiting for her all along. She sat up straighter the moment it was secure, not because it restrained her, but because it crowned her. A symbol, a name, a belonging. Not a label, not a leash. A crown. She looked at him, then really looked. Her chest rising, eyes open, and bright posture calm and proud. And Evan, kneeling before her, felt something tighten behind his ribs. This wasn't the same puppy he had pulled from the box. This was someone new. Someone whole. "She looks like royalty," Lisa whispered from the doorway where she had appeared unnoticed. Evan didn't turn. He just nodded. "She is." That evening, Nova's confidence grew in bursts. She explored every inch of the room, pausing only to sniff her toy pile or bark once at the rolling stool as if daring it to move again. She tried climbing onto the padded bench, failed, tried again, and succeeded with a grunt of effort. She sat there for 5 minutes, gazing out the window, watching the wind stir the branches of the pines outside. Evan let her be. He didn't hover, he didn't call. He simply stayed nearby, close enough to catch her, but far enough to let her fly. And when she finally turned around and leapt awkward and brave off the bench and onto the floor, she landed on shaky legs, stumbled forward, and then stopped herself with a tiny huff of breath. She looked over at him. He opened his arms. She trotted straight in. That night, Evan carried her to the quiet exam room where the overhead light was softer and the walls painted a warmer hue. He placed her gently on the cushioned pad near the heater and sat down beside her with his back against the wall. Nova curled against his thigh, her head resting lightly on his leg. Her breath came slow and even. The room filled with the quiet hum of contentment. Evan reached down and traced a finger over her collar, the name pressed into the metal like a promise. "Nova," he said softly, "means a star that explodes into light." She shifted faintly, the tag chiming against her fur. "You burned quietly for a long time," he whispered, "but you never stopped glowing." He didn't need her to understand the words. He knew she already felt them, in the way her paw rested on his foot, in the way she exhaled against his jeans, in the way her body once folded into nothing, now took up space with gentle certainty. That was what healing looked like. Not bandages, not medicine, but presence. And in the days that followed, Nova took up even more space, sprawling across her mat, flopping dramatically when tired, nosing her toy pile until the fox was just right beneath her chin. She barked twice one morning when someone walked too fast past the glass, and Evan swore it was the closest thing to a warning bark he'd ever heard from her. "She's got opinions now," Lisa said, smiling as Nova barked again. "Good," Evan said. "Let the world know." Every glance she gave him was steadier now. Every touch is more deliberate. She didn't just react, she initiated. She sought contact. She chose closeness. And her collar. It suited her more each day. A flash of blue, a glint of silver. Proof that she belonged. Proof that the puppy who had once been left behind had not only survived, but had claimed her place among the living. And one evening, as Evan swept the floor near her bed, Nova walked to him and gently pressed her forehead to his shin. Not for attention, not for food, just to say, "I'm still here. I'm with you." The golden hour had a way of softening everything. The edges of the buildings, the fences tracing the shelter's perimeter, even the long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement like drawn-out echoes of the day. Hollow Ridge always felt quieter during that time, as if the world was holding its breath before giving in to evening. And as the sun dipped lower behind the ridgeline, it cast a glow through the recovery wing's tall windows, washing the space in amber light, warm and slow and steady. Nova walked beside Evan now, not followed. Walked. Her paws clicked lightly against the floor, the rhythm still uneven. One bandaged foot dragging just slightly, but purposeful. She didn't lag behind. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the deliberate presence of someone who had decided that being near him was the safest place she could choose. Everywhere Evan went, she was there. If he stepped into the supply room, she sat just outside the door, eyes peering in as if waiting for a cue. If he headed toward the back courtyard where the wind rattled through the pines, Nova trotted, close ears perked, nose twitching at scents the wind carried in. If he returned to the clinic to update reports or check on other animals, she padded across the floor behind him and found a spot beneath the desk, curling there, like she'd always belonged. No one had taught her to heal. No commands had been given. It was instinct, or something deeper, an invisible tether made not of training, but trust. That afternoon, Evan stood by the outdoor gate watching the sky shift from gold to pink to violet. The breeze carried the scent of pine needles and dried grass, and somewhere across the ridge, a hawk cried into the open air. Nova stood beside him, her nose lifted, her body leaning faintly against his shin. He glanced down at her. "You like the quiet too, huh?" Nova didn't answer, of course. But she tilted her head toward him, that one floppy ear bouncing slightly, and sat. No coaxing, no gesture. She simply sat. Evan reached down and scratched behind her ear. "You're not just a visitor anymore," he murmured. "You've made yourself at home?" She exhaled one of those soft, grounding breaths that came from somewhere deep in her chest, and leaned into his leg. It was that lean that did something to him. That small, silent act of closeness that didn't ask for anything, didn't demand affection, didn't even seem to expect a response. It was trust, plain and full, wrapped in warm fur, and a heart that had slowly come back to life. And Evan felt it break something open in him. Not the kind of breaking that destroyed, the kind that revealed, that made space. Later, when they returned inside, Evan made his way to the small clinic office tucked behind the front counter. It was his least favorite room: paperwork, and old coffee cups, a humming computer monitor, fluorescent light that always buzzed faintly in the silence. But it had to be done. Records to update. Inventory to confirm. He didn't expect Nova to follow. Usually she'd linger by the door, nose against the glass tail resting on the cool floor. But today, she came in with him. She looked around the small space, sniffed the edge of the file cabinet, then turned and walked straight to him. He had just sat down, adjusting his clipboard and squinting at a chart when he felt it. A weight. A warmth. Nova had lowered herself to the floor beside him, folding her legs slowly, carefully, until her side pressed against his boot. And then softly, naturally, she rested her head on his knee. Evan froze. The computer blinked at him, half-filled forms waiting. But all he could do was look down at her. Nova with her blue sea collar glinting in the fluorescent light. Nova with her floppy ear brushing his thigh. Nova whose chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm that matched his own. She had chosen him. Not for food, not for protection, not out of habit. She had chosen his nearness, his presence, his stillness. And in that moment, Evan felt everything shift. He wasn't just her caretaker anymore. He wasn't the man who found her in a box, the hand that lifted her out of sickness, the arms that carried her through trembling nights. He was hers. That truth settled inside him, like a stone dropped into a calm lake rippling outward, quiet but undeniable. He reached down and let his fingers drift along her back through fur that was finally softening with baths and brushing. She sighed again, head unmoving. She was comfortable there. She was home. The next morning brought new signs. Nova greeted him at the door, not with a bark, not with frenzy, but with a calm presence standing tall on her increasingly steady legs, tail giving one soft wag. She walked beside him to the rehab room, her gaze scanning every corner like she was checking the safety of a space she now considered her own. When he knelt to organize her toys, she nosed the fox into his lap and sat watching. When he sat to write logs on the recovery board, she lay beside his chair and tucked her paw under his foot. And when he reached for the stethoscope and paused mid-movement, thinking of Bella for a flicker of a second, Nova turned her head and nudged his elbow gently, as if to say, "I see you too." That night, after the last lights had dimmed and the staff had left, Evan stayed late. He wasn't sure why. There was nothing urgent to complete, no crisis unfolding. But something about the quiet called to him. He needed to be there, needed to feel the presence of paws on tile and breath against his knee. He sat on the floor of the recovery room, back against the far wall. Nova curled beside him, without invitation, without ceremony. She didn't lay in her bed. She didn't seek her toy. She pressed into his side, and for the longest time they sat in silence. The only sound was the occasional whisper of air through the vents and the gentle thump of Nova's tail, slow, soft content. Outside, the sky burned deep orange, the last edge of the sun sinking beyond the mountains, the trees casting long shadows that stretched toward the shelter. Inside, in the dim glow of the hallway light, Evan looked down at Nova and felt the weight of her choice. He'd been warned about this before. Don't get too close. Don't form attachments. You're a rescuer, not a keeper. But some attachments formed in silence, in shared breath and unspoken loyalty. Some attachments looked up at you with pale eyes and chose your knee over a blanket, your footsteps over solitude. Nova wasn't just recovering. She was becoming. And Evan wasn't just helping. He was being invited in. And just before he reached to turn off the light and leave her to rest, Nova stirred again. She sat up, walked toward the door, then turned and waited for him. The late afternoon light lay heavy across the back garden of Hollow Ridge, painting every surface in shades of gold that looked almost liquid. The garden itself was simple. A few patches of grass softened by weeks of patient care. A narrow dirt path leading toward the fence where pine needles had gathered in small piles, and an old wooden bench tucked beneath the broad shadow of a tree that had seen too many winters. Evan liked to sit there after long days, a place where the world seemed to slow just enough for his thoughts to catch up. Nova was with him, as always now. She walked beside him, without a leash, her paws padding softly over the path, the rhythmic sound oddly comforting. There was no need for commands or gentle tugs. She chose to stay close, weaving between patches of sunlight and shadow like she belonged to both. When they reached the bench, Evan sat, elbows resting on his knees, watching as the horizon burned with the last flare of day. Nova didn't hesitate. She settled at his feet, curling just slightly, before resting her chin atop the worn leather of his boot. Evan glanced down, startled by the quiet intimacy of the gesture. It wasn't loud like a bark or playful like a tail chase. It was a still, deliberate kind of closeness that said more than any sound could. Her eyes half closed, her breath brushing faintly against the scuffed leather. She looked content, as if the world for now was exactly where it needed to be. "You pick the strangest spots to rest, you know that," he said softly, leaning forward to brush a stray leaf from her back. Nova didn't move. Her ear flicked once at his voice, but her head stayed on his boot, as though anchored by choice. Evan sighed, his gaze shifting to the fence line where the pine trees swayed gently under the cool breeze. He had never been much of a talker when it came to feelings. Not to people. Not even to himself. But something about Nova's presence, the quiet steadiness of her gaze, the silent warmth at his feet, pulled words out of him like a tide drawing back the shore. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," he murmured, voice low. "Not just caring for you. That part's easy. I mean, letting myself care. Really care." He paused, eyes narrowing, as though the fading light made the confession easier. "I used to think it was safer to keep everything at arm's length. Dogs come and go at this shelter. Some stay longer, some leave too fast. And I always told myself I could do the work without letting it in too deep. Just enough to get them through. Just enough to send them home." Nova shifted slightly, adjusting her chin so that it rested more firmly on his boot, It felt like an answer, though Evan knew it was just her way of existing, quiet and close. Still, he smiled at the weight of it. But you. He exhaled the sound caught between frustration and wonder. You make it impossible not to feel. You make me remember that I used to be good at loving something. That I used to trust that love, even when it hurt. He reached down and let his hand rest lightly on her head. Her fur had grown soft beneath his fingers, the tangles and grime long gone. He traced the fold of her right ear, the small crease that gave her an almost mischievous charm. I think I'm scared, he admitted. Not of you. Never of you. I'm scared of what happens if I lose this. If I lose you. Nova's breath puffed warm against his boot. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She just stayed. Evan tilted his head back, staring up through the branches overhead. The sky was darkening now, streaks of pink melting into deeper hues of violet and blue. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the sound of a distant creek reached him, soft and steady. The world seemed to hold still, waiting for his next words. You're healing me, he whispered. Every day. More than I thought I needed. Nova's tail moved a single slow sweep against the grass. Evan looked down at her, his chest tight with something unspoken. Do you know that, he asked? Do you know what you're doing to me? She blinked once, then closed her eyes, her breathing even and soft. There was no way she could answer, not in the way people expected answers. But somehow he felt like she already had. They sat like that for a long time, Evan still as stone and Nova breathing quietly against his boot. The light faded, the shadows grew long, and the chill of evening settled into the ground beneath them. He didn't move. Neither did she. When the first stars began to prick the sky, Evan leaned forward and spoke again, his voice softer now. You know what's strange? I think I'm okay with being scared. Because if I'm scared, it means you matter. Nova stirred, lifting her head just slightly. Her gaze met his, pale and steady. He smiled. Yeah, you matter. She stood, then stretching her legs one at a time, her joints still wobbly but stronger now. She nosed his knee once, twice, as if nudging the words back to him. Then she turned toward the garden path. Evan followed her gaze. The light from the hallway window spilled onto the grass, pale and inviting. You ready to go in? He asked. Nova took one step, then paused, looking back at him. He rose from the bench, brushing the dust from his jeans. Okay, he said softly. Let's go. As they walked back toward the building, Nova pressed close to his leg. She didn't need a leash. She didn't need direction. She moved like she understood that wherever he was headed, she would be there too. And for the first time in a long time, Evan felt that familiar ache in his chest ease, not vanish, but soften, like a knot finally loosening after being held too tight. Because this wasn't just a rescue anymore. It wasn't just care or duty or habit. It was a connection. When they reached the door, Evan knelt to wipe the dirt from Nova's paws. She didn't resist. She simply stood watching him with that quiet gaze that felt older than her months, as if she understood more than she could ever show. He looked up at her, his hand still cupping her paw. Thank you, he said. Nova tilted her head, that floppy ear brushing forward. For staying, he added. For choosing me. Her tail wagged once, slow and deliberate. They stepped back into the warm glow of the shelter, and the door closed softly behind them. Evan felt different now, though nothing outward had changed. He still wore the same scuffed boots. Nova still leaned against his leg, but something invisible had shifted between them, like an unspoken agreement sealed under a sunset neither of them would forget. That night, as he settled her on her blanket, Nova surprised him again. She didn't curl up with the fox toy first. Instead, she walked toward him, pressed her forehead lightly against his shin, and then returned to her bed. Evan stood there for a long time, the echo of that small gesture lingering in the room. And as he turned off the light, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe tomorrow would bring even more another look. Another step closer. Another piece of fear falling away. The grass outside Hollow Ridge Shelter was still damp from the morning's dew. And though the sun had since crested high into the sky, thin beads of moisture clung stubbornly to each blade, catching the light and sparkling like quiet confetti. The breeze carried the earthy scent of pine and soil, and the occasional chirp of birdsong drifted down from the branches above. It was a good afternoon, the kind of afternoon that felt stretched and warm, unrushed by time. Evan stepped onto the lawn behind the shelter, the familiar creak of the back door shutting softly behind him. In one hand, he held Nova's favorite toy, a small tattered fox plush with one button eye and fraying ears. In the other, he carried a folded towel, not because he expected rain, but because the grass was wet and Nova's legs were still a little unsteady, and he didn't want her slipping or catching a chill. Nova followed closely behind her tail, lifting in a slow rhythm, curling at the tip like punctuation to her stride. She had grown more confident these last few days, less cautious in her steps, more present in the way she looked around. Today her movements had a lightness to them, like she was testing joy in small doses, watching how it fit across her shoulders. Evan laid the towel across a dry patch of stone near the edge of the garden path and placed the fox plush atop it. Then he crouched nearby, resting on one knee, watching Nova as she sniffed the air, the edges of leaves and the dampness beneath her feet. "You're free to roam, you know," he said, voice quiet, teasing. "No walls out here, just sunshine and possibility." Nova glanced over at him, her floppy ear bouncing with the motion, and then her eyes shifted to the fox plush. And then something happened. She moved toward it, not just walked, but bounced with a little hop in her step that hadn't been there before. She reached the toy, nosed it once, and then, without warning, turned toward Evan. Toy clutched clumsily between her teeth. Her tail wagged. Not once, not slow, but fast, playful. And then she bolted, well bolted as best she could. It was more of a clumsy, determined scamper across the lawn, her legs still slightly too long for her body, her movements more wobble than grace. But the intent was unmistakable. She wanted him to chase her. Evan stood stunned for half a second, watching the awkward, joyful rhythm of her run. She turned her head back toward him, mid-stride, the toy hanging from her mouth, her eyes gleaming. And she barked. It was quick, high-pitched, more of a yelp than a full bark. But it was hers, and it was full of delight. "Oh, so that's how it is," Evan called after her laughter already rising in his chest. "You think you can outrun me, huh?" He took off after her, his boots slipping slightly on the wet grass, his laughter echoing off the nearby trees. Nova zigzagged in front of him, weaving wildly, her tail wagging like a metronome set too fast. She dropped the toy. He lunged. She pounced. The fox vanished beneath her paws as she darted away again, skidding slightly, legs flailing like she hadn't quite figured out how all four worked together. Evan stumbled as he tried to change direction, arms flailing, and landed on the grass with a soft thud and a startled laugh. Nova skidded to a stop and turned back, her tongue lolling out the fox plush now hanging upside down from her jaw. She took one cautious step toward him, then another. Evan sat up, brushing dampness from his sleeves. "You win," he said, catching his breath. "But only because I tripped." Nova dropped the toy in front of him and wagged her tail. Then, without hesitation, she let out a playful growl, high-pitched, tiny, ridiculous. And Evan burst into laughter. It wasn't careful laughter. It wasn't gentle or held back. It was real and loud, and echoed with something he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. She leapt forward again, landing with both front paws on the toy like it was her prize, then glanced sideways at Evan as if daring him to try again. He leaned forward, reaching slowly, theatrically. "You sure you want to go another round?" he asked. Nova tilted her head, floppy ear twitching. Then she nudged the toy toward him. That was all he needed. He grabbed it and bolted across the lawn, laughing like a child knowing she'd follow. She did her run lopsided, full of joyous energy. They chased each other in clumsy loops, slipping, tumbling, grinning like fools. For 15 glorious minutes, it was just them, man and dog, sun and sky toy, and chase. And then at some point, Evan turned mid-run and saw a figure standing at the edge of the shelter. Lisa. She stood there frozen, a clipboard in one hand, her other resting on the doorframe. Her mouth was slightly open and her eyes locked on Nova. She didn't speak for a moment. And then her voice broke softly into the golden air. "She's playing." Evan stopped running. Nova nearly collided with him before plopping down at his feet, panting with pride. He crouched beside her, breathless. "She's playing?" Lisa repeated this time with a smile that trembled. Evan nodded, looking down at the panting pup beside him, her tongue flopping to one side, her eyes sparkling with mischief and trust. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Lisa stepped closer, the clipboard forgotten against her chest. She crouched beside them, brushing Nova's fur gently. "She didn't need training for that," she whispered. "She just needed to feel safe." Nova nudged her nose into Evan's palm and let out a little sigh of contentment. The rest of the afternoon slowed. Evan sat with Nova on the edge of the lawn, her head resting against his shin, her toy now tucked beneath one paw. Lisa eventually left, offering a smile and a wave. The sun began to descend behind the ridge, and the light grew warmer, softer. Shadows stretched across the garden, long and gentle. Evan looked down at the small creature beside him, once broken, once left for nothing, now shining with a life she had reclaimed one heartbeat at a time. "You don't know what you've done to me," he murmured, brushing her ear. "You've pulled me back from something I didn't even know I'd disappeared into." Nova's only reply was a deep, slow breath. And as the sky shifted from gold to rose to twilight, Evan sat there still listening to the rhythm of her breath, the soft ruffle of wind through grass, and the quiet hum of something new growing between them. And just as he leaned back to rest his hands behind him, Nova stirred again. She turned, placed her paw gently on his chest, and looked at him with eyes that were no longer just surviving. They were shining. The morning light was soft that day, almost apologetic, filtering through the shelter windows, like it didn't want to disturb the peace inside. The staff moved quietly, their conversations hushed, their steps a little slower, as if they too sensed that something important hovered just beneath the surface of the usual routine. Nova was curled near the front of the recovery room, her fox toy tucked beneath one paw, her body relaxed but alert. Her ears, always so expressive, flicked at every sound, the closing of a clipboard, the low murmur of Lisa's voice at the front desk, the familiar creak of the filing cabinet in Evan's office. Evan was running late. He had stayed up the night before writing intake notes and reorganizing the clinic supply shelves, trying to focus on anything but the thought gnawing quietly at the edge of his heart. Because today, someone was coming to meet Nova. Not just someone, a family. A couple had read Nova's story. It had circulated through one of the shelter's volunteer blogs and then been shared across a local animal rescue group. They had seen the pictures, Nova curled in a blanket, Nova, with her silver tag Nova mid-play with Evan in the garden. They had called the shelter the next day. "She's beautiful," the woman had said. "She reminds us of Luna." Luna, their shepherd, gone for almost a year. Evan remembered the call. He remembered the tremble in the woman's voice, and the way the man had spoken with long silences between his words, as if trying not to reveal too much too soon. They sounded like good people. They were due at 10. Evan stepped into the recovery room a few minutes before that, his coffee still warm in his hand, his pulse slightly quicker than usual. Nova lifted her head as he entered, her tail brushing softly against the floor. Hey there, sunshine, he said, crouching beside her. You ready to meet some folks? Nova tilted her head. He rubbed the spot behind her ear gently. They're nice. Kind eyes, soft voices. You'd like them. Nova blinked slowly, her breathing calm, her body leaning faintly against his leg. Evan stood as a soft knock came at the outer door. He glanced toward the hallway and felt something in his chest tighten. He didn't know what he expected, a sudden certainty, a swell of confidence that this was the right step, but all he felt was the echo of something hollow, something he didn't yet understand. Lisa met the couple at the front and guided them toward the visitor room. Small but filled with light from the tall windows, a blanket laid out a few toys, scattered a bowl of water on the floor. It looked like a room ready to welcome someone home. Evan walked in with Nova at his side. The couple stood as he entered. The woman was in her early 30s, with long dark hair pulled back into a loose braid and eyes that shone when she saw Nova. The man beside her had a quiet steadiness about him. Broad shoulders, a kind mouth, hands that fidgeted just slightly in the way nervous hope tends to do. That's her, the woman whispered. Oh my God, that's really her. Evan gave a small nod. This is Nova. Nova paused just inside the door. Her eyes scanned the room, nose twitching. She looked at the couple, studying their shapes, their scent, the way their bodies leaned slightly forward in anticipation. And then she looked up at Evan. Her ears lifted, her tail wagged once. Permission. He smiled softly. Go on, sweetheart. Say hello. Nova stepped forward cautiously but without fear. She approached the couple slowly, her gaze moving from the woman's face to the man's hand, then back again. The woman crouched low, extending her palm. Her voice wavered when she spoke. Hi, beautiful girl. Nova took one more step and gently touched her nose to the woman's fingers. The woman gasped, tears welling instantly in her eyes. She's perfect, she whispered. The man knelt beside her, smiling gently. You're even softer than in the photos, he murmured to Nova. She blinked, then looked back at Evan. He was still standing by the door, watching, holding his breath. Nova didn't approach again. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat, but she didn't lean in either. She turned instead and walked back toward Evan, her body brushing gently past the man's knee on her way. When she reached him, she sat at his feet and pressed her side to his leg. Evan rested his hand on her head automatically, the motion now second nature. The room fell quiet. The woman smiled, but it was the kind of smile that knew its edges. She's bonded to you. Evan didn't answer. The man stood slowly, brushing off his jeans. That's a good thing, he said quietly. It means you did everything right. They stayed a while longer, sat on the floor, tossed the toy a few feet. Nova fetched it and returned to Evan each time. They asked about her routines, her favorite foods, how she responded to strangers, what noises made her tail wag. And Evan answered all of it, his voice calm, measured. But inside, a storm was building. Because every time Nova glanced at him, every time her body found his without needing to be called it, confirmed what he had been trying not to admit. She had already chosen. And maybe, so had he. After the couple left to fill out preliminary paperwork, Lisa stayed behind, collecting the empty water cup and rearranging the toys. Evan stood in the doorway, unmoving. Lisa paused. You okay? He didn't answer right away. His hand drifted to the tag on Nova's collar, tracing the edge of the engraving. She came back to me, he said. After all that, after meeting them, hearing their voices, getting their kindness, she came back. Lisa nodded, folding the blanket with care. She's yours, Evan. You've known that for a while. He closed his eyes, his chest tightening. I told myself I was helping her heal. But maybe she's the one healing me. Nova sat beside him now, her gaze calm, ears tilted toward his voice. "She doesn't need a family," Lisa said gently. "She already has one." Evan nodded slowly, his throat thick. "Then I need to stop pretending I don't know what to do." When the couple returned, their faces hopeful, Evan met them outside. He didn't make them wait. "I'm sorry," he said, voice steady but soft. "I can't let her go." The woman looked surprised for a second, then her eyes filled with understanding. The man smiled faintly. "You already belong to each other." Evan nodded. "She chose me from the beginning. I just had to be brave enough to accept it." They didn't argue. They didn't plead. They simply reached forward, patted Nova's head gently, and whispered, "We're glad she found you." After they left, Evan walked Nova out to the back garden. The grass was dry today, the wind slow and thoughtful. They sat together beneath the tree. No leash, no command, just breath and sunlight. Nova placed her head on his foot once more, a habit now etched into both their routines. He reached down and brushed a bit of fur from her collar. "You came back to me," he said. Nova didn't stir, but her tail swept across the ground, once steady and sure. And as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting their shadows long across the garden, Evan knew there would be no other decision. The morning arrived with a stillness that felt sacred. The sky was painted in gentle washes of lavender and rose, and the trees surrounding Hollow Ridge held the hush of dawn in their branches like something sacred. Inside the shelter, everything moved slowly. Lights flickered on. One by one, coffee brewed in a quiet drip, and distant footsteps echoed softly across linoleum floors. It was the kind of morning where silence said more than sound, where breath and presence were enough. Evan had arrived early. Too early. Sleep had eluded him the night before, not out of worry, not even excitement, but something weightier, something quieter. A knowing. A finality. He moved through the shelter like he always did, checking temperatures, reading overnight notes, refreshing bowls of food. But his mind was elsewhere, and his steps kept veering toward the storage room, the place where remnants of intake remained, where forgotten boxes and unused supplies lived out their silent stories. Nova had followed him the whole way, her paws padding behind him with soft resolve. She was calmer than usual, as if she too sensed the gravity folded into the morning. When Evan pushed open the door to the storage room, the smell of dust and old cardboard greeted him like an old friend. He stepped aside to let Nova enter first, and she did, sniffing carefully, tail swaying gently behind her. She moved slowly, her body weaving between stacked crates and folded blankets, her nose leading her toward the far corner of the room. And then she found it. The box. Still there. Still scarred at the corners, still sun-bleached and brittle, still carved with the same cruel words in fading black marker. No need for her. Evan hadn't brought himself to throw it away. Maybe it was for documentation. Maybe it was inertia. Or maybe, if he was honest, it was because some part of him had needed to see it to remember where she came from. But now, watching Nova approach it, he realized the box didn't just belong to her story. It belonged to his too. She stepped closer. Then, with quiet grace, she climbed inside. She didn't struggle, didn't hesitate. She curled herself into the box, like a memory returning to its origin. Her head low, eyes lifted, meeting Evan's without flinching. It wasn't submission. It wasn't sadness. It was remembrance. And then something shifted. Nova's eyes didn't hold the hollow, fragile distance they once had. They were clear now, focused, steady. She was showing him something. Not a plea, a truth. This is where it started, but it's not where it ends. Evan's throat tightened as he stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he crouched in front of the box. He looked at the scrawled words, uneven, careless, cruel. No need for her. He blinked back the sting behind his eyes, and then without hesitation, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the thick black marker he always kept for labeling, and uncapped it. The tip hovered just above the first word. He let out a long breath, then drew a line bold and final through the message. Once, then again. The words vanished beneath the black. He sat back on his heels, staring at the smudged space for a moment, before bringing the marker down again lower just below the scratched-out letters. This time he wrote slowly, carefully, deliberately. Loved, chosen, home. The ink bled slightly into the wood grain, but the words stood firm, bold, undeniable. They didn't scream. They whispered. And yet they were louder than anything else that had ever been written on that box. Evan lowered the marker, his hand falling to his lap. He looked at Nova again. She hadn't moved. She was still watching him. But now she reached forward, lifted her paw, and placed it gently on the edge of the box. His vision blurred. He didn't wipe the tears. He let them fall. Because this wasn't grief. It wasn't even joy. It was release. He reached out and cupped her face gently in both hands. "This box doesn't define you," he whispered. "You rewrote it." Nova leaned into his palm, her eyes soft and full and unwavering. He took one last look at the box, and walked out of the storage room with her at his side. He didn't look back. Back in his office, the adoption paperwork sat neatly in a manila folder on the desk. Evan pulled it open. Every field had been filled, every step ready to go. All it needed was his final signature, and Nova would be transferred to her new family. Except she already had one. He stared at the page for a long moment. Then he picked it up and tore it clean down the center. The sound echoed in the quiet room like thunder. Then he tore it again. Again. Until nothing remained but crumpled pieces in the wastebasket, and the weight lifted from his shoulders like a coat that no longer fit. Nova sat nearby, her eyes following him, her posture calm and present. "You're not going anywhere," Evan said softly. "Not unless you're leading the way." That afternoon, he took her to the back garden. The same bench, the same shade, the same sun is warming the grass. He sat. She curled against his leg. But this time it felt different. There was no waiting, no wondering, no decision left to make. She wasn't just the dog he had rescued. She was the one who had brought him back from a version of himself that had grown too quiet, too careful. She had reminded him what it felt like to choose to hope to open the door again, even when fear sat just behind it. That evening, as the sky turned gold once more, and the stars prepared to rise again, Evan clipped a new tag onto Nova's collar. It shimmered in the light. On the front, Nova Hollow Ridge, and on the back, family. Not temporary, not transitional, real, permanent, chosen. Nova sniffed it once, gave a small huff, then leaned her full weight against him and exhaled. And just before they stood to head back inside, Nova turned one last time toward the distant outline of the storage room and then walked forward, never looking back.